I have had the fortune of being able to talk to um, folks who work in trauma-informed care, therapeutic adventure therapists. Um, but I would say this is probably the first time I've actually talked to someone who is so in touch with both their individual trauma, but the trauma of the people that you work with. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with you, Brandon. If you could, up to you how much detail you want to go into, but if you could share with our listeners your story.
Yeah, I'll go into it high level and I'll let you pry. I'm a very open book. I'll talk about anything. I'm very happy to you know dive into all of that. But just in the sake of time, I'll keep it at a little bit of a higher level. So I got shot 3 times in a drive-by shooting here in Canada, where I live. People don't think gun violence is a thing in Canada. It surely does happen as well. While I was just walking in to get a haircut, so innocent bystander caught in the middle of a gang-related drive-by shooting. I was hit 3 times, so the first bullet hit me in the left knee, which really wasn't too big of a deal. The second bullet hit me, you can almost kind of see there in the top left of my shoulder blades. This is the exit. It came in at the bottom left of my shoulder blade. Sorry, so it came out at the top left of my collarbone. Broke all my ribs, but missed my heart and my lungs. So I was very fortunate there. Given the trajectory, that bullet should have killed me, like surely. So the fact that it missed both my heart and my lungs was nothing short of a miracle. And then the third bullet that hit me, it destroyed my femoral artery in my right leg. So that was by far the worst of the 3 bullets. In many cases, that would be a kill shot because you bleed out so quickly. Very fortunately for me, I had a police officer who was on scene in about 4 minutes, got a tourniquet on my leg, which was about 30 seconds before doctors projected I would have bled out to a point that I wouldn't have been able to be saved. So fortunately, that first response team saved my life, got me to the hospital quickly. I went into an 8-hour femoral bypass surgery that night where they were able to take the saphenous vein out of my left leg, replace the artery in my right leg, so I no longer have an artery in the right leg, and saved my life, gave me the chance to wake up that next morning. I was told that I was probably never going to be able to walk normally again, but they did manage to keep my right leg attached to my body, which was huge because at the time going into surgery, my parents were basically prepped to prepare for me to wake up with a right leg amputation if I was to wake up at all. So I was given a 50-50 chance of making it through that 8-hour surgery where they did the bypass, and then if I survived, my parents were basically just praying that I woke up in amputees. So the next morning when I woke up with my right leg attached, even though I couldn't walk or I couldn't really move for about probably 10 days, I knew I had a fighting chance, and that's all I needed. So I was very lucky. I had a best friend, still best friend, who's a physiotherapist, and worked me out literally 7 days a week, 5 hours a day. It was a full-time job for him. He wasn't working at the time because of the COVID pandemic. It was super strict in Canada. So in a lot of ways, I was the best candidate to get shot as a bystander. But we rehabbed so well that I was able to run my first marathon 13 months later. I've run the second marathon since. I'm actually just starting Ironman training now, 4 years out from everything. So everything has gone about as well as it possibly could have, given the situation. And throughout all that time, I started my own not-for-profit, now registered charity in Canada and the United States called Hit the Ground Running, where we help other trauma survivors cover their costs of recovery. So physiotherapy, psychotherapy, other regenerative medicine costs. So we just paid $50,000 for stem cell therapy for a young man who was shot as a bystander as well. We're doing a lot of things to give kids like me a fighting chance at their new 100% after a life-altering injury, because I think the unfortunate reality is a lot of the institutions that we have in place fall short in a lot of ways. And then on top of all this, we're just about to launch a mentorship program for other trauma survivors. So I'm not somebody who ever thought I would end up in this space. It's very different than my background before the shooting, but all things considered, I'm very happy that I got shot, as weird as that sounds, and I've been able to kind of do some cool stuff with it. So at a high level, that's my story.
So it's interesting as you talk. There's so much positivity centered around this story, which from the outside, if you read it, you think, "Wow, what a tragedy!" And yet, You've turned what could have been a tragedy into a real positive. There's obviously some supportive structures, mindsets that lead you into that. For adventure educators, typically we work in what we call challenge zones, and we talk about this idea of a challenge course and not a success course. And we want to push people into, or not push people, we empower people to take those steps into challenge. What supportive structures around you allowed you to be more kind of positive in this mindset?
Yeah, I've got a lot of supportive structures. I'm very fortunate for that. Sorry, I had a great circle of friends around me when everything happened, which is really important. I had, both my parents were at my bedside whenever I needed it. When I was able to get home, my dad drove me to physiotherapy every day. Would wait 5 hours and then come pick me up. My mom would, do everything around the house, cooked, cleaned, like anything that could make my life a little bit easier. Changed like the toilet that I had in my room because I couldn't leave, like did all of this stuff. So I'm very fortunate that I had them just going above and beyond. But it circles back to when I was a kid. I think my biggest blessing in life is that I had great parents, right? And it's it's funny because the thing that I credit most for my ability to remain positive through all of this is growing up, my dad, the biggest thing that he impressed on me was the idea of never being a victim to your circumstance, right? And there's different schools of thought on that sort of parenting. We're obviously very close now, but he did a really effective job at teaching me that I was capable of doing anything I wanted to do ever, no matter how, high my back was up against the wall, right? Or how many things were going wrong in my life, how many disadvantages I had, or how many advantages I did not have compared to other kids. I was capable of doing anything I put my mind to and really showed up for, right? And I think that attitude allowed me to stay positive because I knew from the start that all that the shooting was going to be for me is an exceptional story because I knew I had it in me to recover, right? Like I knew as long as if they left me my leg and a fighting chance, man, I knew that I could do it, right? There was never a doubt in my mind, even when the doctors said I couldn't, even when people wrote me off, they didn't know me, and I think it's the single most important thing. And I think it's in a simple word, in like layman's terms, it's all hope, right? It's all hope and this unwilling belief, or this, yeah, massive just belief in myself to do anything I put my mind to. So incredible support system. And yeah, that's not necessarily like a monetary support system. I didn't come from a wealthy family or anything like that, but I came from parents who really believed that you could do anything that you set yourself up for. And I think that was my greatest privilege. I also had a lot of close friends who held me accountable. So I think one of the things that I speak with all the survivors I mentor, and again, schools of thought, right? I'm not an expert in the space. I'm just a guy who's lived it, but that accountability piece is everything, right? And it might not be your fault you're put into the situation that you're put into, but had I been shot and I never recovered, it's not the shooter's fault for taking my life, right? It would have been my fault for skipping therapy every day. It would have been my fault for not doing the things necessary to recover. And I had a lot of really good friends, and I actually had a couple of trauma survivor mentors in my circle as well right after everything. And they were the ones who shared that information with me, right? Like I had a ton of people who were out there saying, take your time, process this, relax a little bit. And then I had my survivor friends who were like, dude, it's fine that you feel terrible right now. Like you should feel terrible right now, but you're going to feel a lot worse if you don't start progressing forward, right? And because I had those people in my life who were really pushing me to, be okay and accepting with feeling bad and being vulnerable, but not stagnating because of it, it helped me out tremendously. So I had a great community, and I can't say enough good things. Like there's so many people who've changed my life, and it really does it takes a village, man. And I had that very fortunately.
So, as part of your charity, Hit the Ground Running, it's not just financial that you're giving. You're not just giving money to the survivors. It seems like, and I've looked through some of the case studies. It looks like you're selecting people. There's a mentorship program to it. There's a community center around it. Is there a process by which you select someone? Because I'm assuming that there's a lot of people who might need your services. But
Yeah,
like, is there choices made?
I wouldn't like, yes, there is. It's not anything that's formalized. It's more so how I connect with individuals because we have such a
Mm.
limited budget right now, right? Like we just in my dream situation, we could just help everybody, right? But the reality is when you have such a tight budget, I work with individuals who I connect with from the first call, right? And one of the biggest things that I'll use as a testament to that is I have so many trauma survivors who reach out to me. If somebody reaches out to me and the first thing they ask about is funding, it's kind of a bit of a red flag to me, right? Whereas I've had a lot of people like Isaiah, the young man you probably saw on our website we're
Mhm.
fundraising for right now. When he reached out to me, he just wanted a community. Like he wanted to pick Gavin's brain. He wanted to talk to me about rehab. He didn't ask for any money. He actually did not like he actually like actively said like no, it's okay, I don't want it. But he wanted to have people in his network who could grow with him, right? And he was so motivated and so driven and just so kind that I knew I could work with him, right? I knew I could support him without having to coddle him, if that makes sense, right?
Mm.
And I think for me, the biggest thing is I want people who believe in themselves. I want people who, as maybe bad as it is to say, like aren't victims of their circumstances, but are people who are resilient and, or at least willing to learn how to be resilient and move forward, right? And I think that those are the people who have the greatest likelihood of recovery. And again, there's obviously tons of different schools of thought in this, and there's also a lot of kids that we've helped like gain those skills, right, of resilience, of using their trauma as a powerful tool in their life instead of a net negative on their lives. But for me, it's really just about feel and making sure that if we have a limited budget, the people that we're supporting are able to show up and fight for not me every day, but for themselves, right? And that's something I'm very, very particular with who we work with for that reason more than anything else.
Yeah. At High Five, the organization I work for, our
I
motto is,
love high fives. I didn't know
yeah,
you worked for them. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
they're actually one of the role models for Hit the Ground Running.
The what we do, one of our, our motto is connect, empower, lead. Think that the empowerment part is the part that I often see missed in training, leadership development, team development. It seems like what you almost like what your mindset is set around is that empowering of other people. It's not
Yep.
you just there to hold people up. The point is, it feels sometimes tough lovey, but there's a little bit like you need to allow people to step up themselves.
Yep.
What How do you equate empowerment to that desire to overcome trauma?
Yeah, I think empowerment is everything, right? I look at the first, I've worked with quite a few different kids. Like one of the kids I really mentored very closely was Gavin. So he was one of our spinal cord injury survivors who we're still supporting. And he had the tools necessary at the start, but he didn't have the community that was willing to push him as hard as I was willing to push him, right? And I talked to him, 3, 4, 5 days a week on the phone when he was going through the start of his process. He was shot as a bystander as well, hit in the spine, paralyzed, so different injury than mine. Um, but he started, developing an eating disorder. He was overeating to kind of cope with the stress, and he had his friends in his network who were encouraging him to just return to the way that his life had previously been to as much as he could, right? But I talked to him every day and I gave him the tough love. I was like, listen, you can't be skipping therapy because you went out last night, right? Like you can't be sacrificing the progress that you can make in your new life. And there's going to be people who learn or who listen to that advice. There's going to be people who don't. I was very fortunate that he did. But I think the biggest tool when it comes to empowerment is showing these kids what they're capable of, right? Like now that I've gone so far with Gavin, we're 2 years in, he's like exceeded all expectations that I could have ever had and that doctors could have ever had for him, right? And now I get to show Isaiah the progress he's made, and Isaiah is thinking, if he can do it, why can't I do it, right? And the empowerment comes from seeing the people do the things that you aspire to do and knowing that it's attainable, right? So empowerment is everything because no matter how badly I want to, I can't show up every day and do Gavin's workouts for him,
Mm.
right? I can fund them, sure, but I can't make him go there and work hard. I can't make him put a smile on his face when he's going to the gym. I can't do any of that, right? And if he's not willing to take advantage of the tools that I'm giving him, there'd be no point to the work that I'm doing, right? So empowerment is everything, which I love. It's something
Yeah,
I value high.
I very much agree, and I think that it's, I almost like made a foul up in my language before when I said push people out of comfort zone, because that is a very old school mentality, right? Like, in order to get people to change, I have to push them to make that change. In the flip, I think for a lot of the work that we do in adventure ed is that idea that no, actually, it's far more about giving them control as much as possible, and them seeing the benefits from that control.
Yep.
And conversely, if things don't go the way they wanted, they only have themselves to blame, which feels, oh, that's a harsh mindset, but actually it's a reality of their world, right? You, both in the positive and the negatives, you can't blame other people, just like you said, which I felt was profound. You mentioned if you'd have died from it, the shooter was not at fault, which I think is a very profound thing to consider, because I think that so often the mindset would be blaming the shooter, but you would blame yourself for your drive to not want to recover, which I find very fascinating, really.
Yeah, well, it's as simple as like if I died the night of the shooting, it would have been on the shooter, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
second that I was given even a 1%
Mm.
chance that next morning to get back to good health, had I not showed up every day, that's not on them, right? They
Yeah.
weren't there holding me to the bed and preventing me from
Mm-hmm.
studying, right? I did a lot of studying when it came to the mental health side of things, the PTSD, and a lot of those things that I struggled with. I showed up to physio 5 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Like I changed my life to accommodate to my new reality, right? And a lot of people don't do that, but again, they weren't sitting there with a gun to my head, right? If I was going to sit there and wallow in it, though it might have been super valid, it would have still been on me, right? And I dealt with a lot of struggles during that time. It's not that it was easy, but it was my decision to recover, right? And a lot of people, they don't understand that. And I think the reality is, and again, sometimes it could be considered insensitive to say, but we live in this world where we celebrate like victim status, but we don't encourage people to, pursue greater and take on personal accountability, right? And at the end of the day, accountability is everything, man. As tragic as these stories might be, as tragic as my story might be, if you read it on paper, it's the thing that made me into who I am, right? And everybody who goes through a trauma, no matter how harsh, has that opportunity. Are some of them going to be worse than others? Absolutely. One of the things I talked about talking about vulnerability, one of the things that scared me more than anything was losing my leg, right? I went into surgery. The last words I said before it was determined whether or not I was going to survive were do what you have to, kill me if you have to, don't cut off my leg, right? And like, I don't know how stressful and challenging it would be to go through that challenge in life. But I do know that if that happened to me and I let it be the thing that broke me while I was still alive, it would be a wasted opportunity of a second life, right? And I think it's not that your struggles and challenges aren't valid because they probably are. It's that you have to remain resilient with this gift that you've been given, because not everybody has that, right? I've spoken to a lot of families who haven't, had their sons or daughters be as lucky as I was, right? And yeah, you have to take on that accountability, man. It's so
Mm-hmm.
important.
Let me ask you this, because once again, you're in a unique position. That do you experience survivor's guilt at all? Is that something that has come across for you, or no?
No, it hasn't, and I I don't know. It's not something I've thought about too much, to be honest with you. Like I've had struggles, like tons of different struggles when it comes to the
Mm-hmm.
mental component of what I've been through, but I don't really experience survivor's guilt in the sense that I feel like I'm here for a greater purpose now, right? As
Mm-hmm.
maybe like maybe that sounds cocky, maybe that sounds whatever, but I feel empowered to use my story and my second chance at life to live a life in a way that I believe I was placed on this earth to do, right? And so I don't really feel survivor's guilt. If anything, I feel like I'm here for a real reason, and that's kind of the thing that keeps me going. So I've dealt with a lot of struggles, but
Yeah.
that's not one of them.
Good. We'll check that off the list. I don't want to. Now you're going to start having it, or because I
No,
asked the question.
no.
So for those educators out there, because what I have experienced, and I think it's actually I think it's an incredibly positive thing, and I think it's a development that we've had over the last maybe decade. More people being willing to talk openly about struggle, about trauma, and so you start to have this larger community formed. And I've experienced in the world that I work in, I might bring people up to a course and I experience traumatic responses, either PTSD or others, around being pushed into a stretch position, where it just brings out other scenarios for them. It calls back to a situation they've had in the past. What's your recommendation as someone who's experienced trauma for educators who haven't, about how to deal with people who then talk about trauma? It's a hard, because but almost like, what would you hope that educators would address you with? Because I feel like sometimes the energy, even as I said it at the start, speak as openly as you want or not. I'm adding that disclaimer because I'm nervous about creating an experience you feel uncomfortable with, right?
No, no, no,
That's my
no.
default setting. So I want to be more open to having conversations with, that make you feel good, but is that necessary? Like, that's where I'm
Yeah,
rambling
no,
a bit.
I think it's a tough question to answer as someone who's not, overly versed in the field. But the two things that come to mind, I think, is one of the things I really struggled with, because I did, psychotherapy, which is a little bit different, but maybe more in the similar vein. What I really struggled with was people who were just reading from a textbook basically, and then telling me what emotions were valid, what weren't valid. They treated me kind of like a child more than they treated me like a grown adult who'd been through this situation, right? And that was something that really bothered me. And it's why I found so much value in working with mentors, right? Working with people who'd done the thing that I wanted to do, because I saw myself in their shoes, right? If they could do this thing, I could do this thing, right? Versus when you're reading from a textbook and you're telling me how I should feel, it's not overly helpful. Like, some people it might help, right? For me personally, that wasn't what I connected with. So I think, just as silly as it sounds, like, just keep it real. Like, treat these people like adults, like, grown men, and hold them accountable. The uncomfortable truths are what allows you to recover properly, right? The
Mm.
things that you probably don't want to hear the week after you've been shot from somebody else are oftentimes the things that you need to hear to recover, right? And I think if you can use a combination of, maybe a survivor story that you've heard, right? Like, maybe you connect with somebody who's been through a similar trauma to me, right? Maybe somebody who's been shot, and you say, like, listen, this is my friend, I've met him. Talk a little bit about the story, and then talk about how some of the things that are most important when you're working with these individuals, and kind of, relay it to them in a way that doesn't feel like you're just regurgitating
Mm.
textbook information, if that makes sense. Because
No,
those
very
were my
much.
biggest beeps at the start. I didn't want people like treating me like a second class citizen because I've been through this thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think ultimately people just want a sense of community and feeling like
Yeah.
they're not alone in a situation. And what we do really poorly if we don't talk about stuff is realize there's community. Because if you hadn't had those mentors, found out, reached out, heard about others, and now you're offering it to other people, then that's where
Well,
you
and
become
one
isolated.
I was going to say one thing I'll say too, and I think this is also, it's really important when it comes to the mentorship piece, is there's good mentors and bad mentors, right? And there's going to be people that people connect with, let's say, but I look at a kid like Gavin, for example, and he had a publicly funded mentor who helped him adjust to life in a wheelchair. But this individual was like a 65-year-old guy who, never did any of the things that Gavin wants to do in his second life, right? And I look at the foundation that you work for, and I love them. Like, I can't say enough good things about the work that you guys do. But there's a young man in there, his name's Andrew Cougar. He does some rides, he does something with the high fives team.
Mhm.
And I was able to connect him with Gavin, right? And then they could talk about like bike adjustments and doing these things. And you need to have somebody that you can see yourself in as a mentor, right? You need somebody that you can connect with and aspire to be like a little bit and learn from, instead of somebody you feel so disconnected to, right? And that sense of community, when you find that person, is beautiful because it creates hope. And if you have hope, nothing else really could stop that, right? There's no force
Mm.
more powerful, I think, than hope. It's the reason you show up at the gym every day. It's the reason that you believe in yourself to achieve the ultimate goal. Um, and one of the things I love, and I say it quite often to the kids that I work with, especially with spinal cord injury survivors, is you might not ever walk again, right? Like, I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I can't give you the I can't look into the future and see where you'll be. But if you're not showing up every day, I can promise you where you won't be, right? You will never walk again if you don't try. And if you spend the next 20 years fighting for it and it doesn't happen, you're going to be pretty happy with the guy you've become along that process, right? And yeah, it all comes back to surrounding yourself with the right people who are on the same wavelength as you, and not just, you know, I guess maybe this part is a little insensitive sometimes, but like I don't want to create a support group. Like I don't want a group where people just complain about how hard their lives are and all their problems. I want a group of people who uplift one another and talk about their goals, their aspirations. And in the trauma community, there is both, right? You do get people who use it as a group to just talk about how hard their lives are. And those people, they need probably psychotherapists, right? Like they need a different community, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the mentors that you want in your community, they're lifting each other up, right? They're not complaining. It's not a complainer group. It's an accountability and hope group. And that's what I try to cultivate. So yeah.
Yeah, I love it. There's a chemical in the brain, and you're probably aware, called serotonin. Serotonin is a joyful chemical, and we often refer to it as the leadership chemical. Um, and you experience that a lot in support groups that, you know, a classic one is Alcoholics Anonymous. The 12th step is service or stewardship. And it's often you're paired with somebody else. And the idea of that is that you award each other the chips, 30-day chips and so on. And the consideration there is it's done from a supportive nature of mentor and mentee rather than staff member and alcoholic, because as you receive that chip, you're both given a boost of serotonin. You both sense that sense of joy, but also it reduces dopamine, which is that quick fixing. So as we talk about, people just sitting there and eating, that's the dopamine hit, right? That makes you feel joy, but it's only temporary. It doesn't sustain. Serotonin sustains and can help that growth. So just from a neurochemical perspective, all the work you're doing is leading towards that idea of leadership chemicals in play.
I appreciate it. And one of the things I really value about the communities that we build is the long-term goal is for me not to have to work with any of our new grantees, right? I bring on Gavin, for example, I mentor him effectively. And now when somebody comes into our program who has a similar story to him, that's certainly different than mine, right? He can become a leader, right? And that transformation is, like you said, the final step, really, I think, in overcoming that life altering situation, or at least learning to process it in a different way, right? It's how you find purpose in this curveball that life has thrown at you, right? It's how you knock that curveball out of the park, right? Is you find a way to use the thing that should have broken you to make the world a better place, right? And when you're able to do that, you start looking at your trauma a little bit differently, right? You start looking at that hardship you've experienced in a positive way. And I think for me, part of why I was able to respond to this so well is I knew that from the start it was going to be something that was good. And you talk about the openness that we have with one another. I think what becomes really interesting is when you have a story like mine that you're so open with, you're so vocal about, people come to you with all these things you never would think that they're facing, right? I've spoken to so many friends, strangers even, with the hardest things that they have going on in their life that nobody else knows about, right? And in a really, before I was shot, that would have been a lot of stress, I think, to take on. But after going through that, I realized most of these people just need an outlet, right? I don't need to give them the answers. I don't need to solve their problems for them. They just need somebody to know that they can be vulnerable and authentic with. So yeah, I don't know. I forget where I lost track of my point there, but it's something that's beautiful about the trauma community in particular is when you start openly speaking about the hardships and struggles that you've been through, you, in a really weird way, lift other people up because they're able to feel like they're not alone. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Storytelling is like a huge part of the human condition. If you follow back in history, we used to sit around a fire and share stories. And I think that at some point we drifted away from being able to share our own. And so I appreciate your willingness to share your story. And And I know for you, it's a very positive and empowering experience rather than a reintegration or a remembrance of trauma. And so I just want to shout out you and appreciate you for that. The last thing I'll just mention in here is I'm going to throw in all the description into the description, all the stuff about Hit the Ground Running and the opportunity and the case study on Isaiah, who's they're currently raising funds for currently. And I encourage you to do so. I will also do so myself. I'm going to practice what I preach on that one. And so thank you, Brandon. This has been a real pleasure.
No, thank you, Phil. This is wonderful. I always love talking with people who are in the space and learning as well, right? I'm not somebody who ever learned any of this by a textbook. I learned it just by by living it, right? So it's always really interesting and eye-opening for me to connect with individuals who have similar sort of goals and aspirations in life and are good people. I think one of the things that I'll often talk about is I want to see good people win. It's really my whole purpose to this second life that I've created for myself is I it would have been really easy for me to see the worst in the world after literally being shot walking into the barber shop and almost being murdered, right? But the reality is, no matter what the mainstream media might tell you, no matter what all of the content you're consuming every day might tell you, 99% of the world is an awesome place. People are good. People care about each other. People want to help and grow together, right? And if I can do that with my second chance at life in a limited capacity, I'm very, very fortunate to be able to do so. So, yeah, I love the work that you're doing, and I hope the audience is doing well and appreciative of the good work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brandon.
No, thank you.
And I'm going to stop the